part two of our podcast, looking into the critical issues facing Muslim women in public life, we pick up where we left off discussing how social media impacts the experiences of Muslim women in public life, how policies and practices exacerbate the challenges they face, such as gendered Islamophobia and intersectional factors that impact Muslim women in public life. We also come up with something of a wish list of practices that we would like to see that effectively address these challenges.
Yes, Salma and guest. Okay, I have screaming baby. That's no problem. And we
We all
said
do. We all
we,
do.
and yes, so it's okay, Salma. I will let you kind of just maybe listen to the conversation a bit and then you can come in. But thank you for so much for joining us. Um, and again, I will properly introduce Salma when she's ready to speak. So yes, something that I didn't include in the questions, but just listening to the conversation that you guys were having, especially the last bit, the idea of like the feminist voices and how they speak when it's convenient or when it suits their sort of agenda. What do you guys think is the influence of social media in all of these experiences of Muslim women in public life and the structural inequalities that they're facing, especially gendered Islamophobia? Like, how do you think social media is contributing to, I think, we said the expectations that are kind of put upon us, how our own communities respond? Are there voices on there that are encouraging it? Are there voices supporting allies? Any responses for that, guys? I'm sorry. I know I just threw that question out, but I had to ask because I felt like it's such a key player now, social media, like in everything that happens, especially in politics, like and the media as well. But yeah, anybody want to tackle that?
I think my experience of social media is that it's such an echo chamber. So it's basically whatever you believe is sort of legitimized, and a lot of the content then you then see and ends up being people with similar voices that add rationale to whatever your sort of viewpoints may be. So if somebody goes into social media with, a kind of a racist outlook on life, or doesn't believe in equality of between men and women, whatever, they will essentially be fed back a lot of content that rationalizes and legitimizes those views. And so what essentially ends up happening is nobody's views are really challenged, and everybody's views are further and further ingrained and legitimized. So that's why I think in recent years we've seen this sort of movement towards more sort of not extreme, but more sort of polarized views when it comes to issues of race or issues of equality. It's because of the fact that social media essentially backs up whatever we believe. And so even we're all guilty of it. Even when I look at my content and my feed, it's generally stuff that I agree with that is essentially in my feed, my Twitter timeline. Yeah, great, like that, like that, like that, because these are all voices that I sort of agree with. And I've, in my sort of social media footprint, they acknowledge that, and the algorithm basically regurgitates similar content for you. So I find that social media basically doesn't challenge people's views. It doesn't present a wider scope of views beyond the views that you hold. And so essentially what happens is whatever views people go into it with end up being ingrained, unchangeable, and people become more and more resolute in if they had a racist viewpoint, they'll become more and more resolute about that. If they had a sexist viewpoint, they'll become more and more resolute about that. And the bad side is that both of those affect us negatively. And so essentially a lot of the challenges that we face get more and more sort of ingrained as well.
I would agree with you completely, Sharman. I think that social media and the way that algorithms are configured are essentially echo chambers, as you said, and they kind of present problems around confirmation bias. So we're hearing our own views, as you said, regurgitated. And I think not only does it regurgitate and confirm, there's an issue of emboldening.
Yes.
So you then have these narratives that have roots, whether they're sort of historically rooted narratives, whether they're sort of rooted in policy, political discourse, for example. And the media or social media becomes a mouthpiece for all of that. And the way that the social media circles work that is different to print media, for example, is that further confirmation bias. And the more you hear your views confirmed, the more you're likely to feel that you are in a position of absolute truth, that what you know and what you think is right, and therefore you then see, I would hope, just a fringe, but in increasing numbers of individuals who feel emboldened enough to act on those things that they hear.
Yeah.
And whether that's sort of through the growth of sort of misogyny online and the sexism online, or whether it's through racisms and Islamophobia, you see people who are likely to, perhaps at the base end, vote in ways that confirm those things. But then going even further, you see an exacerbation in interpersonal violence, and growth in hate crimes, etc., because people feel that, well, I am right and what I know is the truth, and I therefore must act on it. So it actually has, whilst it's an echo chamber, whilst it's a mouthpiece for broader historical and political narratives, it has very real implications for marginalized communities. And I think that, and I'm sure many people feel this way, that there needs to be tighter regulation of online spaces, meaningful regulation of online spaces, but perhaps there are elements within this puzzle that might be a bit reticent and reluctant to have that sort of regulation.
Especially when you consider how much of media in general, so I mean online media, print media, just media in general, is intertwined with the political sort of discourse of our day. We see from the inside how much political parties, political players rely on the media for good coverage, and therefore not challenging the media in terms of regulation, having appropriate regulation that protect minority communities, is almost seen as a quid pro quo for good coverage. So you leave us alone and we will give you, we'll be kinder in our coverage of you. And we actually saw that in real time with the reporting of the deal essentially made with the press, and Labour essentially shelving Leveson 2 as a sort of response to support within the support for Labour within the sort of election space. So it's not. Sometimes I used to question myself and think, am I just conspiracy theorizing here? But it's not. In when you're in politics and you see some of the sort of conversations and the ways that political actors behave and interact with media, media actors, you realize it is a quid pro quo situation. So when you've got that circumstance, how do you really get meaningful protection for minority communities? How do you really get meaningful regulation that keeps a lot of these sort of online media actors, but also print media actors in check?
Thank you so much. I feel like that has satisfied my curiosity into, how social media contributes to all of this. I think we've really touched upon the next few questions that we had, in a sense that how do you think intersectional factors compound? We've really discussed that, and also gendered Islamophobia. I feel like we've really touched upon that. But I do want to ask you guys if you feel like there are any specific policies or practices that kind of exacerbate this issue. So we've spoken about hijab bans and how that contributes to Muslim women's loss of agency or feeling excluded from certain circles. But is there any specific policies beyond that you both feel might contribute to this kind of difficulty that Muslim women are facing? If not, it's fine, but it would be great if you have any input to that.
There's actually so much. That's the problem, is there's so much that needs to be done that which one do you prioritize and which one do you sort of talk about first? It's the whole political system needs overhauling, in my view. I think the whole political system is interspersed so much with money and sort of key sort of voices, political voices being driven by sort of money that's been donated to political parties, and therefore their politics is suddenly in sync with those sort of with where that money has come from. So I think one of the key spaces that needs cleaning up is the political space. I think private corporate money and sort of big private donors, that element really sort of means that a lot of the key issues that matter to normal people like you and I will always be overlooked in favor of the people that essentially bid the highest for political space and political decision making. For me, cleaning up politics means taking money, big money, out of politics. I know we don't have, our system isn't as bad as, say, the US system, where money essentially drives everything. You know, big lobbies like the gun lobby, etc., you know, really drive the sort of political discourse. But we're not that far away here. And I think we're on a slippery slope. I think things like, you know, having private companies sponsor political parties, etc., that kind of thing we need to sort of walk away from, and looking at political donors and the voices behind the political donors and the movements behind the political donors, we need to really scrutinize that and sort of move away from a space where political parties are effectively reliant on these donors to run elections. I think one of the things, and this is me being slightly biased and my political sort of alignment sort of coming out. But one of the things that the Green Party have come out with is this removal of all private sort of funding of political parties and publicly funding elections and political party spending, so that we aren't beholden, no political party is beholden to these sort of big sort of lobbies and voices, etc. And therefore, politics can be more representative of the people that it's meant to serve and the people that it's meant to represent. Ordinary people can have a sort of their issues represented at the top. And I think for me, that's one of the number one ways of cleaning up politics in more general. But then what it will do is it will mean that minority communities who are often at the sort of at the top when it comes to being, you know, scapegoated during an election period or during any kind of, you know, political sort of campaign, they will then be less likely to be the issue of the day. It will be more about the issues that actually matter to normal people, like paying their bills, paying, you know, getting housing, or just being able to feed their children. You know, those types of issues will suddenly become more important to political parties. But for me, number one is to try and clean up the political space and take private money out of it as much as possible.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Amina, did you have anything to add? We're happy to, it's good. We're okay to move on if you felt like.
Yeah, happy to move on. I was just going to say that, you know, even though we're not as affected in the UK, I do think that the narrative in the US shaped the experiences of Muslims in the UK and other European countries. I think part of the problem is that Islamophobia is globalizing. It is a global problem. So we're not removed, unfortunately, from a lot of what's happening in US politics with the big lobbies and the ways in which politics is funded. And I think perhaps to add to that, around the funding of politics, it's about having a more critical public who are able to dissect some of that media, to dissect some of the political discourse and the decision-making processes therein, and really think about what are the real issues, as Sharmen said, that matter to us on the everyday. And I think it is about understanding as well the way in which that a lot of power functions on having an other, the creation of a demonized other. And if we as a public are able to understand this more articulately, perhaps this might go some of the way to contributing towards eliminating some of the issues we're facing as a Muslim community and as Muslim women in particular.
I think that reference you made to the critical public, one of the things that I found is that the place that the sort of city I live in, Leicester, it's got 24% Muslims. And when I came into politics, I thought, this is you know, this is like a huge political sort of voice we should have. You know, we should be leveraging this space and, you know, leveraging local politics, leveraging this voice to, you know, shape national politics, etc. But one of the things that I found was that people were really scared to be troublemakers. They were scared to push the narrative or appear as challengers. And I think a lot of that sort of can be traced back to the way that Muslims were portrayed in the aftermath of the war on terror, and the way they were seen as problem communities. we got to the point where Muslim communities were essentially being conditioned to sort of stay silent as a way of staying out of trouble. And we've seen that even in recent years, you know, in the recent general election, where we've seen Muslim communities move away from mainstream political party, moving towards independence, moving towards the Green Party. But we've seen the narrative as well as a consequence. The narrative, certainly in the media, has been, oh, this is extremist elements sort of dictating these movements away. Well, maybe it's just a legitimate choice. And this element of seeing Muslim voters making legitimate choices just because they happen to vote against the grain, seeing this narrative is really, really disturbing to me. And we can directly compare it to the way Brexit voters were treated in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum. There was this real movement to legitimize, you know, I was a Remainer, so I was very, very angry in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum and, you know, blaming all sorts for my, you know, anger. But at the time, there was this real sort of attempt to sort of not blame the voter. You know, every voter votes with the information that they have to hand and the information that political actors give them, right? And so there was this real attempt to understand why people voted for Brexit. But when it comes to Muslim communities and them suddenly moving their votes away from the places that they've held their votes for over the last few decades, suddenly that understanding is amiss. You know, it's suddenly talking about extremism and movement, you know, tying them with all sorts of sort of political movements abroad, etc. And that understanding, that lack of understanding, and that lack of trying to rationalize why Muslim voters vote a certain way is emblematic of the, you know, ingrained Islamophobia within our political discourse.
I would agree completely. I guess for me, it kind of evokes these notions of disciplining the Muslim community. So disciplining them into silence through securitization narratives. And I think the securitization narrative is crucial here. I think we could take it even further back and talk about sort of Orientalist tropes, whereby Muslims kind of under British colonialism, French colonialism, and so on, were seen as problematic communities. And you look at earlier generations of immigrants, you see that internalization, and there is perhaps a growing confidence moving away from that colonial disciplining that is now simultaneously being quashed by the securitization narrative. So it's almost like it's coming in waves, and there are new tools and new discourses to silence Muslim agency, Muslim autonomy. And it kind of brings us back full circle to the notion of Muslims as voiceless, Muslims as not knowing better and not knowing what's good for them. You have these ideas that circulate that they couldn't possibly know what's right for them. And if they are doing something and they say it's their own choice, well, they're impacted and influenced by all of these external factors. So it is this kind of continual disciplining of Muslimness in various guises.
That's exactly what it is. And I think disciplining is a great word. I think that's essentially what it is that no way that they act is legitimate. Every way that they act needs to be corrected or problematized. And yeah, I absolutely agree with that.
Thank you both so much. I really liked the last thing that you said, Amina, in the sense it was disciplining Muslim communities. I have written that down. I'm going to be using that now. I kind of want to start on something more positive. I feel like we need that now a little bit. And I asked this question with full knowledge of the kind of more experience, more knowledge that you both will have in this area, and asking what are some examples of successful policies or practices from around the world that we see, which has kind of addressed adequately the struggles that Muslim women face in public service and other sectors. And I think Salma will be joining us in a bit, so we will start with this question and then we'll bring Salma in. But yeah, over to you guys. The resounding silence tells me that there is.
It might need a caveat. It might need a caveat to hear that.
Okay, what would you
adequately addressing? I'm not sure that that's happened yet. Maybe this might be a wish list of policies and practices.
Okay.
That we'd like to see. I think if they're thinking about it as a wish list, I think in a lot of the work and research that I do, I would welcome greater engagement with Muslim communities, greater engagement with Muslim women in particular, especially when legislation and policy is being passed around their very existences, and not speaking on behalf of Muslim women all the time. I think that for me would be, perhaps it's a very low bar, but maybe that is a standard to be striving towards, across sectors, whether that's sort of private institutions and organizations or more broadly in politics. A greater engagement with Muslims and Muslim women, rather than just speaking about them and for them on behalf of them.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. And I would just add that acknowledgement of the sort of the barriers that we face. It's so lacking in terms of our rights, that we just having that acknowledgement of some of the structural barriers that Muslim women face, that in itself is seen as a win. But the fact is we don't have that. It's in very, very small sort of quarters. You will see like organizations or specific actors who will talk about these experiences, but it's not mainstream. So what I would like to see is, and on top of what Amina has just mentioned in terms of engagement, is the acknowledgement of the fact that we do tread a tougher path, and whether it's in public spaces or in the professional space, in all sort of walks of life, Muslim women are prejudged and sort of have to face obstacles from all different types of communities and in different ways. And I think that multi-frontal sort of firefighting that we have to do, I would just like to see some acknowledgement of that from political spaces, and that probably is a tall order, because when we look at the way that we're talked about and Muslim communities in general are talked about, we're pretty far away from that as it stands. I know this was meant to be more positive, Sameeha. I'm so sorry.
Hey, it's okay. Yeah, I guess
I tried.
No, it's okay, because maybe I was really optimistic or a bit naive maybe with that question. And I feel like when Amina said a caveat, I was like, oh my goodness, yeah, you can't, it doesn't, yeah, there's no such thing as like adequately addressed. So anything else you guys want to add to the wish list? I mean, I'm trying to think of something that I feel like, I would like to see, but I think I've just been so caught up listening to you guys, I haven't really thought about it from my own perspective. But yeah, anything else that you guys want to add to the wish list? I'm not trying
I
to
think
draw
one
this out.
positive thing, I think one positive thing that I would add is seeing Muslim women going out there and sort of, fighting for their space and sort of doing the things that I think, they have a right to do. So like key sort of political voices, when you see people like Ilhan Omar and in the States, when you see the likes of Zara Sultana, the likes of Naz Shah, you see Baroness Warsi. When I see Muslim women going out there and just basically taking no mess, let's say that. I don't think we're allowed to swear on here, but no, just being basically unapologetically demanding their rights and demanding their space in the political sort of sphere. I think that is a cause for positivity, and that is something that gives me some hope, because there are women out there that are trying to sort of break down some of these barriers in spite of all of the challenges we face. And if you're asking for some of the positive elements, that they would be the positive elements of, for me anyway, just looking at their success and seeing, in spite of all of the structural challenges they've faced, all of the sort of I'm sure the things they've had to navigate over their careers, the fact that they're still out there as key respected female Muslim voices, that is a cause for positivity and joy for me.
I think you have redeemed that question.
I tried my best.
Thank you so much. And sorry, Amina, did you want to come in then?
I was just going to say the same. I think that's it. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm very much in awe of these women that are actually going out there and taking up that space. And they're taking up that space in spite of the numerous barriers that Muslim women face. And I think that's something we should be celebrating and recognizing that we've made strides in that regard, and that perhaps wouldn't have been possible, say, 50 years ago. So we are making progress, albeit slow and steady.
Mm-hmm. And I think to taking up space is such a powerful thing. So that's a wonderful addition to that question. Thank you so much. I think my son's timer has run out. He's suddenly needing me again, so you can hear him coming up the stairs. Hopefully we can power through.
Hi, Salma. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. How are you doing? Let's see how I get on with this. I've got 2 kids awake, around. It could all kick off at any minute.
As we said yesterday, Salma, they never sleep at the right time, do they? Ever?
No, they don't. I could have tried a bit harder to get one to sleep. The baby, I can't really control her. And I haven't got my lenses in.
My strategy used to be
really,
just stick them on if I had
holding the baby
thing
in my
to do.
lap. The baby in my lap, the laptop in my hand, and my 2-year-old is obviously going to want to come in now to see what's going on. So,
metaphorically balancing
to the max.
everything.
Thank you so much, Salma, for joining us despite all of those, I don't want to say challenges, because I feel like these moments are beautiful as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's what this is all about, right?
It
This is what
right.
our conversation is all about. I need to actually try and get the laptop straight, though.
That's okay.
I feel like I'm a bit wonky. There you go.
That's okay. So yeah, I've said that you're going to be joining us, so I'm really excited now to finally be able to introduce you. Salma Yousef. She was called to the bar in 2008. She holds an LLM from the University of London with a specialism on criminology and criminal justice. As a practitioner, she specializes in criminal prosecution, particularly high-value fraud, organized crime, and money laundering. Outside of work, she sits in a quasi-judicial capacity as a chair of the Valuation Tribunal. She is a founding member of Women in Criminal Law. She is a trained mediator in family law, workplace, and special education needs. Salma also delivers training. Oh dear.
This is a very long bio. I think you can cut the rest out. I'd forgotten how long this bio was. That's enough. And basically, I'm just a lawyer.
I'm sorry.
It's such a
you know what? This is like clearly a
response.
bio that I regurgitated or reused from something that I needed to send it to for some speaking engagement. So yeah.
Salma, if you were a guy, that bio would have been twice as long, and
Probably.
you would have never said, basically, I'm just a lawyer.
But you know, in the guy space, there are so many people competing for that. Let me make mine so long. With women, we're around loads of accomplished people. It's just a given that everybody is accomplished. There's no competition, and that's where we flourish. Like where everybody is okay with acknowledging that everybody else is really amazing too. My competition is not the guy or girl next to me. It's like, you know, I'm on my own trajectory, and yeah, it makes me sad that like when people don't think like that, and it's really encouraging and refreshing when you're around women who are just like, yeah, she's done a lot. Like I just looked up your bio whilst I was waiting because I'd forgotten some of the messages you were sending me during the election when you started talking about the Green Party. I was like, let me remind myself, because Sharmen's coming out with some really good stuff. I didn't even know she was going to be on this call. Let me just remind myself who she is. And so it's just really like, it's so nice being around other inspiring women who are who are really inspirational. And one of the things I was going to say on the back of one of the things you ladies were talking about, I instinctively say you guys were talking about a couple of things. I think one of the positives is there are a lot more quote unquote women around the table. So the voice is being heard, but I think there's still a lack of women around the table who, you know, every time there's another factor which shows you're Muslim or where you talk like you're Muslim, there's less of those. So there's more acceptance, I would say, of women around the table who don't look like Muslim women. And then like politically, the ones who, you know, it's only now that the confidence is building up where people are willing to talk about Palestine and human rights because the voice is becoming mainstream. Otherwise, the women who are supposedly representing the Muslim women voice were the ones who would largely go along with the mainstream narrative. And we've seen that like so much. We saw it in the lead up to the elections that, you know, there was, you know, you dissent and you get kicked out. And so if we look at how many, I'll take it. If you look at how many Muslim women there are who might represent the values that we stand for, I feel there is still a real shortage. Sorry, I'm just giving my daughter something. And one of the other things I was going to say is, in terms of barriers, is it okay for me to kind of go into some of the earlier questions?
Yeah, no, of course. I think it would be great to hear from you.
Yeah, in terms of one of the barriers I was thinking about as you guys were talking about it, I think it was talked about a lot in the political space, but just like this old boys network that exists, whether it's in politics, whether it's in some of the more traditional professions, whether it's academia, whether it's law, there's still a really major old boys network. Now, the reality is that women don't have the time or the bandwidth or the inclination often to schmooze, to do all of that extra stuff. Women like generally want to be accepted as is. Like, these are my credentials, I'm good at what I do, and that's it. And a lot of these professions are still controlled by the old boys network, which requires networking, which requires out of hours socializing, and that is a major issue. So in order to progress, something's got to give, and generally it's the woman who's going to have to give in her profession if you compare two people who start at the same level. Because if she has kids, you know, I need a profession that I'm going to largely be able to, you know, work flexibly around my kids. And so the reality is that, that I'm going to have to recognize that I won't necessarily progress. And I think that affects Muslim women more to a degree, because I think a mixture of, there is cultural pressure, like your priority has got to be the home. And also, you know, I think, you know, we want that as well. Sometimes we might push back because we don't like being told that. But we also want it. Whereas I think in Western society, I'm not saying that, you know, like Western women might not be as family orientated, but I think it's more normal, for example, for them to put children in nursery earlier. They may draw on family networks more. Certainly, I find that, you know, asking for help from older family members or whatever is a lot harder. And I'm generalizing a lot here. So, you know, it may be that those networks might exist actually a lot more for Asian families, or they don't. But I feel the reality is that ultimately the buck lands with us. It's not going to be a 50-50 split in terms of who's going to be responsible for the childcare. And if one person is going to have to compromise on their career, then it's going to be the women. So those were some of the things that I wanted to mention in terms of what you ladies were talking about. And then I'll have a look at my notes.
Simultaneously, there are a lot of Muslim men, or perhaps it's the circles, and there's that confirmation bias, the circles within which I walk, that I do see Muslim men stepping up and taking on, and men in general stepping up and taking on some of those responsibilities. But I think that that's perhaps not universal, but there is change, and I think some of that catalyst for change can also lie with Muslim women in terms of the ways in which we socialize our own sons, brothers, etc., and kind of the expectations we have, you know, even in our own marriages, that might begin to drive change there. I think that's, you know, an important potential. Or maybe I'm just too optimistic.
No, I think you're right that there is a lot more of that. And certainly I'm lucky, because I wouldn't have been able to run a political campaign while I had a newborn at the time, and doing all of that without a supportive partner would have been impossible. So you're absolutely right. There are more examples of certainly Muslim men stepping up. But I think that element of making high stakes choices for Muslim women, but women in general, is just, it's it's a biological one as well, right? Because we have to. I remember as a, when I was in my 20s, trying to figure out, do I focus on my career now and then have my children later? Or do I have my children now and then focus on my career later? And either one had costs and either one had implications that were quite big, right, to our lives. So those conversations are ones that men don't have to have with themselves. They don't have to think about these things. And I think that's a massive complication for women in general, but also it's exacerbated when you look at the way Muslim women are perceived and the Muslim women are expected to be certain roles within their household, etc. So all of these elements just add to complicate already what is a very, very challenging sort of landscape for Muslim women, whether it's in the professional space or in the political space. But I absolutely agree with Salma's sort of experience. It's a difficult, navigating the professional space is very, very difficult when you've got all these other things to juggle and balance, and you simply just don't have the time to go, networking when you've got children to get home to look after, etc. So I remember being, I used to be in banking a long time ago, and I remember those conversations in my own sort of head, thinking, how do I manage this? And how do I sort of essentially plan the rest of my life so I don't lose out on one thing over another? And the reality is we all make choices that essentially in one way, shape or form, something will have to give. And usually it's a woman, and in the reality is in her career space, that's the bit that gets compromised. And structurally, we don't have the system that acknowledges that sacrifice from women. We don't have the systems in place to sort of compensate women for that loss in the workplace, for that loss when it comes to pensions, etc. So, again, we're battling the system as well as trying to figure out all of these things in our home life as well as our professional life.
Yeah, I mean, in case that bit isn't edited out, my husband is very supportive, but I don't think he's ever done a call. Don't think he's ever done a call with a 1-month-old on his lap. He'll occasionally have the kids going in and out of calls. So I think it's changing, but it's changing slowly, and the bulk of the burden is still with us. And we're still ambitious, and so we're still trying to make it all work. One of the other things I was going to say on policy was, like, there was reference to the hijab ban, and obviously there are places where there is hijab ban, but there are also the sort of underlying Islamophobia, even where there isn't. And the fact that, there might not be a hijab ban, for example, in the UK, but the views that might form in a lot of people's minds when they see a woman in hijab, who might also mention that she needs to get home to the kids or whatever, there's a lot of work to be done around. There's a huge education piece and understanding, Muslim women as individuals, because I think the media for so long has created this, perhaps not even hijab, but if we talk about niqab, women in niqab, the Boris letterbox comment, I don't think is far off from how a lot of people may think. And again, that is a stereotype, but when I look at around a workplace, and sometimes I ask the question, and sometimes I just wonder, like, how many Muslims do you interact with outside the people you meet at work? And therefore, what is your primary source of information about Muslims? And certainly, I feel that a lot of people I interact with professionally, who might not live in London, might not live in a diverse borough or in a diverse area, I really think a lot of them don't interact with Muslims outside the handful that work in my team. And therefore, what is their exposure and what is their source of information and what are they forming their views on? And so how likely is it that they're going to take a Muslim woman really seriously? And therefore, I think, again, it's so important to have Muslim women at the table, not as a token, but, being part of the policy making, being part of the conversation and the dialogue, so that people are hearing the voice rather than forming a view from secondary sources.
That's a really interesting point. A lot of the research evidence in the UK, but also in France, where I've kind of studied further, shows that the highest support for far-right parties and often their Islamophobic pledges are from areas with very little to no diversity. So it's people that aren't encountering Muslims or encountering racialized people that are very perhaps afraid of what racialized people might do and might mean for the country. And I find that quite fascinating. I think it resonates with the point you're making about not having interactions with Muslim communities or communities of color and then deciding lots of things about them. And it kind of comes back to that wish list I mentioned, just having Muslim women at the table, having Muslim women as part of the discussion and decision-making processes. As with other marginalized communities, I think it's hugely influential and can only enrich the policies that we make and the narratives that we build as a society. It doesn't detract from, rather it adds to.
Yeah. I find it really encouraging. There's a speaker called Khalila Lister who does TED Talks, and I love the fact that she goes and speaks at Sky and speaks at, big companies and completely, changing what people expect a woman in niqab to be like. And, for so long the narrative has been she must have been forced, there must be a man behind, the decision. And she's a Jewish revert. So she is such an interesting, got such an interesting story. But I think we need more people who are part of that discussion at the table, who are part of the policy making, who are part of the dialogue to challenge all of this, I think.
Thank you so much, Salma, for your contribution, Amina and Sharmen. I feel like we've spoken so much and we've shared our experiences, but also this incredible wealth of knowledge as well has come from all three of you. So thank you so much for your incredible contributions. I think as a host, I get the privilege of just listening to what you guys are saying. And I think in parts it was quite emotional as well, because especially when Sharmen was talking about how we are taking up space regardless, like we are showing up. And I feel like that's such a powerful thing. And I want to wrap this up just with a very kind of like, if there's one thing, and I know it's very hard and you probably don't like the questions that go one thing because you cannot put it into a one thing. But if there's one thing that you guys feel like institutions, organizations, the systems that we work in, they could change one thing to dismantle the barriers, what do you guys think? And I know it's a hard question, so feel free to like take a minute to think about it also. But what would you say is the one thing that they could be doing? And if we've already discussed it and there's snippets of answers, I'm sorry, I'm asking you again, but I'd really just want to hear like a finality, like from you guys. Sharmen, I feel like an idea is brewing.
There was something that was kind of going around in my head, and it was just coming back off the comments that Salma sort of mentioned about Boris and the letterbox comments. For so many that his comments provided an avenue by which people got to feel they were very anti-racist, because they, condemned. It's easy to condemn that comment, but it's not easy to sort of look at the underlying Islamophobia that is actually prevalent across all of the political spectrum. And I think that is the one thing that that is different to that is different when it comes to Islamophobia in comparison to other equalities issues, is that Islamophobia is so normalized and it's almost a credible form of prejudice, in the sense that when you look at, I can't remember who did this study, but when they did this study in terms of Islamophobic attitudes, they found those in higher income thresholds, those with holding a degree or higher education, those with more of a professional sort of outcome. Islamophobia is one of these sort of prejudices that is actually more prevalent as you go up these socioeconomic factors, whereas other racism, say for instance, anti-Black racism, is more prevalent in lower income or working class communities than it is in in sort of higher income, sort of educated communities. And I think looking at the way that Islamophobia has been sort of exacerbated and legitimized in mainstream political discourse means that we have to acknowledge that it is different to other forms of prejudice, in the sense that it is so ingrained, it is so legitimized, it is almost a credible way of doing politics. And I say that as somebody that's been in frontline politics, I say that as somebody that's worked in policy, I say that in my real experience of frontline politics. I've seen that Islamophobia is almost seen as a sort of a tick box. You have to be a little bit Islamophobic in order to be politically successful. And we've seen that and we've seen that in the disappointing language both Conservative and Labour Party have incorporated when it comes to demonizing Muslims, demonizing migrants. And we see how this prejudice has become a sort of a tool and a tool invoked for political success. And that is the sort of the character of Islamophobia that kind of differentiates it from other forms of prejudice that I think needs to be acknowledged. And people really need to have a reckoning. Political spaces, certainly political actors, need to have a reckoning that they have played a part in sort of legitimizing it, but also to check it when they are sort of indulging in that kind of scapegoating because they see it as a tool to be politically successful. And I think that's the one thing about Islamophobia that I find so utterly enraging as a Muslim, and trying to raise Muslims in this in this society, is that this prejudice is almost seen as a positive thing. Being a little bit Islamophobic actually helps you politically, and that's just this really harsh and awful truth, but it is true.
I think that race to the bottom can't be the only way to do politics. I absolutely agree that it is so normalized. It's almost like a vote scoring mechanism. And really, we need to be calling that out. And there needs to be greater sort of buy-in across the spectrum, left and right, of people calling this out and normalizing the calling out of Islamophobia rather than the actual Islamophobic discourse itself. It's not the only way to do politics. We can do better.
Thank you guys so much for that. Salma, would you like to?
Yeah, I think I just want to piggyback on the back of both of those points and say, I think I'm always really scared about mentioning Islamophobia because I feel like with other communities, they're quite confident about the prejudice that they faced. And I feel with Islamophobia, I kind of feel like, people are like, oh no, the Muslims are doing the poor me thing again. I think I'm comfortable with the term anti-Muslim prejudice because people will say, oh, I'm not Islamophobic, I'm not scared of Muslims. But there's clearly anti-Muslim prejudice, like cutting across sectors, cutting across society. And I think maybe there needs to be an assessment of, different sectors, different workplaces, and they kind of carry out, not like an equality impact assessment, but carry out, just give me 1 second. They carry out like an assessment, there's some kind of tool to look at, what is, for example, on race in the legal profession, there was sort of a study looking at race inequality at the bar, looking at culture, looking at, progression, looking at things like that. And I think there's scope for something like that to happen. The other thing I'm noticing is that certain communities who have historically, had a lot of support for the prejudice they faced are very quick to call people to account. They'll report, they'll, get the regulatory bodies involved, and we kind of just take it. And I think we need to mobilize and be calling it out collectively a lot more. So yeah, those are sort of two of the things I think would be beneficial. That there is a more formal and robust mechanism to call it out, and also that there is more of an obligation on workplaces to take this quite seriously, in the same way, for example, that race discrimination or anti-Semitism or other areas have been investigated.
Thank you guys so much. My little one's getting cranky now. And yeah, I don't want to bring this to a close, but I know we've got things to do. So thank you guys so much for your contribution.
Well, from my perspective, it has been really nourishing to my soul to just listen to you ladies speak and hear, some amazing Muslim women doing some amazing work as well. So very, very nice to share this space with you all.
Yeah, thank you. I just echo your point, Sharmen. And let's keep in touch, definitely, Sharmen.
Absolutely.
I think the scope, if you're interested to come into DMU and talk to the students and stuff about your experiences, I'm sure they'd be very keen to hear kind of
Okay.
since you're one of our sort of local candidates in the last run. I think it's very, very important. So we'll keep in touch, inshallah.
Absolutely. And let me know any way we can sort of work together. Absolutely. I'd be up for that.
Thank you.
Honestly, it's been such an enlightening and interesting, wonderful discussion, and I'm so glad that we all got together in this one place to have these important discussions. And I think some of the questions were quite tough, like there's no black and white, and as we came to realize that it's an ongoing process, but there are elements of it that's getting better, elements of it that really still need.
So it's really great to hear all of those perspectives. And for those of you listening, thank you so much for joining us. We hope that you benefited from these discussions. And stay tuned for more episodes of Community Policy Speaks.